Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And we see that there's only one focus point in today's video, and that is the battle southeast of Avdiivka in the industrial zone, from which we have this video here, where we have this single Russian tank within the industrial zone, if you can call it that, with how everything is completely destroyed. There's nothing but ruins left. We see this Russian tank driving around, hitting the buildings, just doing whatever it wants. There's no shots against it, there's no artillery against it, there's no ATGM against it. It's just driving around, hitting the buildings as it wants, continues bombarding this same building. It seems that it has likely located some Ukrainian soldiers within that building, and then it's just demolishing it completely. So we're seeing that it just continues to shoot at the building. So this tank drives around here in the industrial zone, and we then go on to this second part of the video where we see Ukrainian soldiers running away, withdrawing from that building. So it seems that it was hitting the right building. Doesn't really seem that there were any casualties among the Ukrainian forces, but they all retreat out of it. This likely indicates that the Russian forces will likely take full control over the industrial area, with all of these Ukrainian infantry running away after the tank left. This also puts the question as to why there was this large lack of infantry support for the Russian tank, why the Russian tank was by itself. Where's the artillery support? Where's the Russian artillery on these retreating Ukrainians? There's so many questions to that, since they clearly had a drone looking at these infantry running away through the road here west of the industrial zone towards the residential area of Avdiivka. So this puts into question the Russian capabilities in this section. But at the same time, we see that they are pushing the Ukrainians away. They're running away from the industrial zone, which leaves it firmly in Russian hands. We have this picture from Syriac maps, which shows the different locations in the area. The Russian forces continued the shelling of Sarkovo here in southwest Avdiivka, and then the geolocations of the Ukrainian forces running away from the industrial zone, as well as where the tank was shooting here in the central part of the industrial zone. So we're seeing that the fighting took place here in the industrial zone, and the Ukrainian soldiers left in the direction of the residential area. This all raises the question, is it that even with former Wagner soldiers, the Russian army is simply incapable of launching large enough attacks to actually take advantage of these retreats by Ukrainian forces to take full control over the areas? Is this why we're seeing the fighting being so slow, that despite the Ukrainian forces leaving, they still are not able to advance? Or is this all part of some megamind strategy of the Russian forces? Let's find out. But before that, there are some things I have to clarify. I had some discussions with Russian and Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front line here and there in this war. They told me and spoke with me on the basis on being anonymous, but I have verified based on evidence that they have provided that they are ones who actually have fought on the front line. And based on what they told me from the Russian side, this is about the more tactical and operational approach rather than at a whole strategic level. But essentially, when we see fighting like we see here in the industrial area, the biggest concern for the Russian forces is their lack of communication. The biggest issue both sides have in this conflict is their lack of encrypted direct communication. For example, if the Russian forces, for example, in the tank was fighting by itself on its own volition, then it lacked the proper communication for quick response by the Russian army. Because first off, if they communicated to use the radio or other items they have at their disposal, the Ukrainians would almost definitely interrupt it and either jam it completely. There's a lot of jamming happening by the front line where they are completely unable to even communicate, or it would be intercepted by the Ukrainian forces being able to listen in. Likely in this scenario, it's not the listening in, because even if the Ukrainians know they're going to be bombed, they'll not be able to pick up a countermeasure quick enough. It's likely that the communication was jammed and it was actually staying by itself on the front line. At the same time, the Ukrainian air defense is very capable, to the point where Russian planes are not able to fly within 15 kilometers of the front line Otherwise, they expect to be shot down. They can fly a lot lower, but in that scenario, especially the helicopters, they are very vulnerable to direct fire. So with that, we see that the Russian forces are not able to receive air support when they are storming these fortified positions of the Ukrainian forces. This is why it's so slow. And at the same time, communication is very difficult due to the jamming of the communications. So with that, the units at the front lines mostly work independently from the larger group. If they want to use larger organizations like a division size to attack, it becomes very difficult due to the lack of communication. And at the same time, large groupings of forces are easily the target of HIMARS strikes, of artillery strikes, and so on. So with that, we see that the Russian forces are incapable of grouping up their forces for two reasons: lack of communication and heavy artillery and multi-launch rocket system strikes by the Ukrainian forces. This, of course, counts for both sides, as this is why we saw that the Ukrainian summer offensive failed, because they weren't able to properly communicate between each other. The Starlink gives them a big improvement, but the Russian electronic warfare is still able to jam and intersect their communications despite the Starlink usage. So all in all, these operations are very small in scale and very separate in smaller squads, groupings, companies, and so on, due to the difficulty of communication. This is also why we saw that the Ukrainian soldiers here in the industrial zone were so grouped up. That is because they had to be able to communicate with each other. So there was likely some sort of mobile command center where the company commander was calling and naming orders for its soldiers to organize the defense of the industrial area. So with the commander giving the order to withdraw, they all withdrew together. The jamming, however, is very limited and is for a limited period as well as distance. Therefore, we saw that the drone operator likely had little to no communication with tank or other operatives like the artillery support, which is likely why we didn't see any artillery strikes and so on. So it's not because the Russian army is incapable of doing it, it is because there was no communication to give them coordinates, to tell them where the soldiers were, and so on. The tank likely retreated due to lack of signs of life, and then the drone saw the soldiers and then couldn't communicate to the tank operative that they were retreating. And that explains articles like this one. Day 639 of war, Kiev, Russian forces attack Avdiivka from all directions. So we're seeing these reports of fighting everywhere, yet we do not see any advances by the Russian forces in the area since quite a while ago. The latest advance was actually on the 22nd, which was 3 days ago. Therefore, this is likely because of the lack of communication and lack of organization of both armies due to the jamming of communications and so on. Therefore, we see a very limited size of operation whenever they attack. The largest operations we've seen in the Battle of Avdiivka was on the first day of the operation, where they launched dozens of tanks and armored vehicles in the northern flank of Avdiivka. However, they were all combined together. This is to make ease of the communication, but at the same time they will all be jammed at the same time and for the same period. Therefore, they fell for the trap the Ukrainians prepared for them, where they all launched strikes at the same time, because the Russians were also jamming the Ukrainians, but they weren't sure where they were and so on, which made it difficult for them to target specifically the areas where the Ukrainian artillery and MLRs were, and likely were limited with the range. And therefore, the Ukrainian forces were able to ambush the Russian forces and launch heavy strikes on them. So we're seeing that the advantages that are available in this war is being able to make unpredictable operations, and that is very difficult due to satellite imagery, drones, and so on that reconnaissance the whole front line at all times on both sides, with the Ukrainians having help from NATO reconnaissance and the Russians having their own reconnaissance. So with that, we see that it becomes very difficult for either side to launch major operations, because they end up failing to be able to communicate with each other and failing to organize large assaults because of that. And at the same time, these major minefields slow down the offensive very much, which makes it difficult, even if they have a pre-plan, to go through, as the defenses are much more unpredictable than offensives. The reason for that is that defensive positions are predetermined, while offensive operations are like water. They go where the resistance is the lowest, and therefore if the defenders prepare some positions for the attackers to go into, they will likely fall into that trap. And that is what we saw when the Russians attacked in the north. That is what we saw when the Ukrainians attacked here in Zaporizhia. They were pulled into the Verbova direction. They were pulled into the Robotyne direction. And in the end, we saw what happened, and the Ukrainian offensive failed. And that is all for this update. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.